In the short term, it will have an impact on earnings because it's going to result in a step back. But as you saw in the market today here in the United States, the stock actually went up. Twitter's biggest problem is really focusing on the big picture, and the big picture is the role that it played here in Washington on January 6th. It was a day that shook America when a mob came to Washington and attacked the nation's capital. That bloody and deadly day could not have happened without Twitter and other companies within the social media space having those kinds of toxic information and misinformation really lead the charge and help lead to, unfortunately, a very sad day in America. These companies, including but not limited to Twitter, have already been up against the ropes here in Washington, taking a lot of body blows by Congress in various hearings. I believe that, as we'll be able to discuss, there are a number of United States senators that are also looking right now at very significant changes that are going to have a very big impact on companies like Twitter.
And as we know, social media companies continue to promise more transparency anytime, major issues arise. But lawmakers, as you mentioned, they seem to want more. So what share of responsibility should be on the shoulders of the social media companies versus the content creators or the users themselves?
Well, the social media companies always try to sing a happy tune when they come into these hearings in Capitol Hill to try to say that they recognize this and they understand that. But frankly, it's just a bunch of lip service. They're very bad on transparency. People don't trust them inside and outside of Congress. They have really terrible showings in front of these committees. And we have, for example, major developments where the senators here are going to be leaping ahead of them. So, for example, Senator Warner and Senator Klobuchar are co-sponsoring a bill that was announced just a couple of days ago that's going to blast a huge hole in the American law known as Section 230, which gives blanket immunity to companies like Twitter in social media, really letting them off the hook for any kind of harm or damage that occurs within or as a result of fake news or things that are occurring on those social media platforms. This is going to mark a major change, and this could be something that they're really not ready for. And I think that the viewers of social media really have a lot of questions as well. They see there's no transparency, and frankly, a lot of people who are being attacked because of social media need this help that's happening in the United States Congress right now.
So if that measure by lawmakers does get pushed through, how should Twitter and these other social media companies be rethinking their strategy and their mission? Like, how do they refocus at this point?
Well, I think that, first of all, they need to have very public and transparent rules to let people understand when they're going to apply rules as they should be enforced in the future. So, for example, when Twitter and Facebook said after the deadly and bloody day of January 6th that they were going to, after the fact, remove President Trump, I understand that that was highly controversial and there's a political conversation that could be had on that. But obviously, that was a very late reaction, and a lot of the skepticism is because they're not proactive, they're not transparent, and they don't apply even-handed rules. These rules are going to largely be thrust upon them, and when Congress does make these changes, and I believe it will happen in a few weeks, it will fundamentally change the way news is received and digested in America.
And certainly there is that distinction between news versus, say, a social media platform. How is all this going to be untangled, do you think, by regulators?
Well, I think that the regulators are going to, at the end of the day, probably need to enforce the final back-end rules as to applying the changes that Senator Klobuchar and Senator Warner are proposing. But I think a lot of it's really also going to be up to the courts. Until the social media companies and corporate America that is within the social media universe is held to some kind of standard of accountability, there's not going to be any change. People aren't going to have faith and trust, regardless of what their political affiliation is. And there are people right now, as the Senate is recognizing, that are getting attacked and that are at physical risk because of misinformation and hatred that's being spewed through social media that now needs new regulation. So big change is coming.
So just very quickly, until any sort of change does kick in, what does that mean for some of these other platforms that this has now given rise to that have either less or no moderating of content?
Well, that's a good question. So you have other conservative platforms such as Parler, for example, and there's some talk that President Trump may set up his own platform. However, if these changes in Section 230 occur, it will apply to a level field. So therefore, these kinds of changes will be universal, and we'll be seeing them coming out from here in Washington over the coming weeks.